prepared to stay around my talk afterwards. Make that go away. So I'd like to initially recognise that we meet, of course, on the land of the Kaurna people. Add my acknowledgement to that given at the start of the meeting. I'm 38 years old, and in the time that I've lived in the Adelaide region, I've seen a pretty strong deterioration in our ecology, and I think we have a lot to learn from the Kaurna in terms of how to live in a sustainable way. So we need to have respect for that culture and pay a lot more attention to it. The conversation that I will begin tonight is drawn from two presentations. One that I gave earlier this year in a presentation for the Conservation Council, which was reflecting on some of Adelaide's tree protection laws, and the other is a presentation that I will be giving later this week for the TreeNet Symposium, which will be talking about some work that we've been doing in understanding the diversity of Adelaide's urban forests. And so I'll talk more about those things, but it would be good if we could not post anything up online until next week, so that I don't get in trouble for that. Wonderful, thank you. So what should an urban forest look like? An urban forest is all of the trees that exist within a built-up area within Greater Adelaide, for my purposes. Does anyone have any adjectives that they'd like to throw at me?
Biodiverse.
Biodiverse, yeah, that's a good one.
Understory.
Understory, yep. So structurally diverse, yep. Anything else?
Insects.
Insects? No, I don't care about insects. Plants are much more interesting than insects. When I had a think about it, I decided that we needed an urban forest that was extensive, that was diverse, and that was functional. And if you these three things pretty much encompass most of what we need in some way, and I'll delve into a bit more detail on each of those. So there are some rules of thumb that have started to emerge over the last couple of decades in the urban forestry field. The first one from Cecil Conandick from the University of British Columbia came out in 2021, and he came up with this idea of the 3-30-300 rule. And this is the idea that from your house or your office or wherever you happen to be within the city, you should be able to pretty easily see 3 trees. Shouldn't be hard. You know, you shouldn't have to stand on your roof or anything like that. You should be able to open your window, stick your head out and see 3 trees. Your neighbourhood should have a total canopy cover of about 30%. And this is associated with high levels of public health, reasonable levels of urban biodiversity, lower crime rates, a whole host of benefits that are associated with living in a healthy community. And that you should be able to access a park or a green space within an easy walk of your home or office. You should be able to do that within about 300 metres. And that green space should allow you to meaningfully connect with nature, whether that be reading a book under a tree, or whether that be seeing some butterflies or looking at a bird, or whatever it is that you do to connect with nature, because that's important to us. The other rule that I'll show is the 10-20-30 rule that was introduced by Frank Santamore in response to some of the urban forest problems that existed in North America, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But this was in response to the decimation of the urban forest in North America due to Dutch elm disease. They had a huge dominance of elms in America, and Dutch elm disease, an introduced fungus from Asia, decimated those populations. And he was the one who posited that, okay, maybe we need to start hedging our bets and maintaining a higher level of taxonomic diversity within our urban forests. So he, as a kind of a starting point, suggested 10% of any one species should be the threshold, 20% of any one genus, and 30% of any given family. In the age of climate change, this has been revised to probably being something more like 5, 10, 15, 5, 10, 20%, something like that, as being more realistic for the threats that we face. So let's talk a little bit about these metrics, you know, these ideas of extent, diversity, and function. How are we going in Adelaide? Tree cover is actually pretty easy to measure. We have been doing that for the last 10 odd years in Adelaide using airborne LiDAR. So we commission a plane to fly over the Adelaide metropolitan area or greater metropolitan area. And LiDAR gives us a pretty accurate idea of what our treed vegetation is at any particular height. And so we regard anything higher than 3 meters as a tree. In 2018, a flyover revealed that we had an urban forest of about 25% cover, which is a little bit lower than we would like with that 30% baseline, 30% target. And there's huge heterogeneity within Adelaide. And you can see on that map up there that there are some quite green areas. Some areas of the city of Mitcham are well over 50% cover, while some suburbs are well below 5% cover. We have some suburbs, particularly in the extreme north and the extreme south of Adelaide, that are sitting at around 2 or 3%, barely a tree in those suburbs. And they tend to be associated with lower socioeconomic areas. So people who have lower incomes, poorer health outcomes, also tend to have lower canopy. And that correlation is partially causal as well, because we know that canopy is important for people's well-being. There was a new flyover that was completed last year. The results from that are still being processed, but all of the evidence that we have is that despite the best efforts of local government, state government, and others, our canopy has declined in that period. You know, we are losing trees faster than we can plant them. There was a report that came out from NIRMAP a bit over a year ago that suggested we were losing about 75,000 trees a year in Adelaide, and that was primarily on private land. This was primarily driven by urban infill. So taking a big block of land, carving that up and putting 2 or 3 or more houses on that, and the big tree in the backyard goes as a result. And I'll give you some examples of what that looks like shortly. So limitations that we have to canopy growth are active tree removal, mainly on private land, council limitations and utility restrictions. So this is on public land. We have quite a lot of public land, particularly on our road verges and our reserves, but many of those, much of that land is encumbered in some way. For example, we're limited by the trees that we can plant under power lines because we have rules about not planting trees that are going to grow into power lines and cause a risk to public safety or a fire risk. So we have strong encumbrances there. And then we have climate change, and this is both chronic and acute, and the secondary impacts from climate change. So what I mean by chronic impacts are just that general ratcheting change that means that Adelaide's climate becomes less and less suitable for the trees that we typically grow in Adelaide. The acute impacts, where we have a heat wave or a drought event or a major storm that can remove a lot of trees very quickly. And then, of course, the interactions with pests and disease. And we know that as our climate is changing, that is impacting, that is stressing many of our trees, reducing their health. And it's also increasing the transmissivity and the virulence of some of our pests and diseases. We've seen this with various outbreaks, including the giant pine scale in different parts of the city, and that's now become entrenched in Victoria, as well as a host of other insect pests. And may well become an increasing problem for fungal pathogens as well. So talking a little bit about regulations that we have in Adelaide. In this report that's on the top right there, which was produced a little over a year ago now with some colleagues at the University of Adelaide, we examined the protections that were used in interstate capitals to protect trees and lead to a higher canopy. And we found that about 2/3 of them use some form of size-based protection for trees. And we do that here in Adelaide as well. We use a circumference-based protection. So when a tree reaches 2 meters in circumference at 1 meter above the ground, we regard that as a regulated tree. And once it reaches 3 meters in circumference, which is a big tree, that is then significant. And that has a slightly higher level of protection. Interstate, about half of the councils that we looked at used circumference protection. Slightly more used a height-based threshold. And 20%, so 1 in 5, used a crown spread-based threshold. And I'll show you what they look like. So the circumference threshold was used by about half of the councils, and a 50 centimetre circumference, which is about that, was used by about 3/4 of the councils that we looked at, so the vast majority. And these tend to be local laws interstate. In South Australia, all of our tree protections are wound up in the Development Act, and so there is no capacity for councils to pass their own laws around these things, which occurs interstate. We do it all at a state-based level. 100 centimetre circumference, so about that big, that was used by 95% of councils. One council had 140 centimetres, and this is where South Australia sits. So we are protecting only the girthiest of trees in South Australia. This is a real problem when you consider that some of our most iconic trees that we should be protecting are unlikely to reach those kind of thresholds. And I'm thinking here particularly of things like Eucalyptus microcarpa, the grey box. Things like red gums aren't quite such an issue, but some of our smaller trees unlikely to reach these thresholds in many cases. Height protections. So this gives you a bit of an idea about the kind of heights that trees need to reach in order to be protected interstate. About 4 to 5 metres is pretty common. So that would be probably about the height of the ceiling, a little bit higher maybe. So we see a lot of, we don't have this at all in South Australia. And then crown spread. Crown spread is actually a really useful method because unlike height or circumference, trunk circumference, you can measure this remotely. You don't need to go onto anyone's property in order to measure it. You can use Google Earth or Nearmap or any one of a suite of remote sensing tools to be able to unambiguously say that is a protected tree. There are some issues with this. We have deciduous trees, and of course their crowns change, and a little bit of judicious pruning can indeed reduce the crown circumference of a tree as well. So in our report, we recommended to the state government that they investigate using some of these additional methods like tree height and crown circumference, and reducing the trunk circumference thresholds to be able to protect more trees as a way of reducing that canopy loss on private land. Another thing that certainly requires a bit of a look is the idea of distance exemptions. So there are a lot of exemptions to protections in South Australia. So you may well have a regulated tree, but in a typical Adelaide home, 10 metres from a house or an in-ground swimming pool is a radius that says any regulated tree or significant tree within that space is exempt from protection. And that's because it is assumed that that tree may well have an impact on the stability of the house foundations or the swimming pool. There's no evidence that it needs to be having an impact, but there is an assumption that you don't want a tree that close to your house. And what that means in reality, particularly as we move to smaller and smaller block sizes, is the vast majority of the urban area is exempt from tree protection. Eucalypts aren't exempt from this, but eucalypts make up an increasingly small fraction of our urban forest on private land. So it is a bit of an issue. And certainly there can be arguments over what even constitutes a eucalypt. So for example, corymbias are currently regarded as appropriate for removal, despite the fact that they're very, very closely related to eucalyptus. When we consider the situations that exist interstate, this is what exists in the minority of interstate jurisdictions, where you might have a 3 metre clearance envelope around a house, or you need an engineer's report to say, yes, this tree is certainly impacting the foundations of this major structure. And in the vast majority of situations, there's no distance exemption. If you want to remove a protected tree, you need to be able to demonstrate that tree is having an unacceptable impact on a major structure. And a major structure is not something like a carport or a swimming pool. It is a house.
Excuse me, Stefan, do you want to take questions whilst your presentation? I've got one from the
Yeah, I'm happy to take as we go.
So does distance exemption apply to street trees?
So street trees are owned by the public. They're owned by local governments. And so it's up to councils whether they remove those or not. Most street trees are not regulated or significant. It's rare that that they will achieve that. Reserve trees will a little bit more often, and certainly they will require they will reach regulated or significant status with the protections that are granted from those. But if they are within, you know, say 10 metres of a public library or something like that, then those exemptions would still apply. Yes.
Plane trees, I imagine, given that last diameter circumference parameters,
Not protected generally.
Over time, would get to be large and have large diameters, potentially able to be protected. But gum trees, which afford habitat potential, wouldn't get to that side. Yes, wouldn't it?
I think generally eucalypts would have more of an ability to reach those kind of circumferences in Adelaide than plane trees. The biggest plane trees I've seen in Adelaide are probably at the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Botanic Gardens, and that they would be starting to approach those regulated and regulated levels. But certainly the ones in you know, in the city, they would not be of enough size to get those kind of protections. Certainly things like blue gums and red gums, they will regularly achieve protections, but smaller gums, unlikely to do so. When you look at a lot of our street trees are things like coral gums, they would never achieve that kind of size.
I just wonder whether the expression forest is appropriate given the fact that forest is a self-generating community of plants, whereas this in a sense is a plantation. The trees have been planted.
Yeah, I think that if you want to take a strict ecological view of these things, you could definitely make that argument. I'm using forest. I mean, the term urban forest is commonly used, and I'm using it, and I guess the discipline generally uses it as a collection of trees. So, yeah. We also exempt a number of species from protection, and we've decided that for one reason or another we don't like these trees, or they're not worthy of protection. Some of them are on the basis that they are climatically a bit dicey, so things like the silver maple and silver maple on that list, possibly also the London plane, are unlikely to maintain their climatic suitability in Adelaide in the long term. So there's been a suggestion that, you know, we shouldn't worry too much about protecting those trees. Others, and the vast majority on this list, have quite strong weed potential. So desert ashes, for example, have a huge propensity to colonize waterways. Certainly in many situations, though in the urban environment, I would argue that those trees are possibly worth retaining because they are, you know, they are good performing trees that do form habitat and have biodiversity value. Also exempt are trees in orchards, plantations and woodlots, you know, those kind of plantation trees. And these species determinations are really important. This tree is a spotted gum, or it was thought to be a spotted gum, that was up in Beaumont, and that was within 10 metres of a house. So because it wasn't exempt, an arborist was able to remove that tree, and following its removal, one of the neighbours complained, and it was realised actually it was not in fact a Corymbia, it was a Sydney blue gum, and that tree had been illegally removed. That arborist was potentially up for a $120,000 fine under the Development Act and PDI Act. I believe that arborist received a fine of about $5,000 for the sloppy removal of that tree. So it was potentially a fairly low penalty, which is another concern. There are very few.
Arborist identified.
It was, yes.
Tree.
Yes, the arborist identified it poorly.
Right.
So if we have a bit of a look about how this plays out on the ground, this is, I believe these houses are on Portrush Road. And they show, we've got a block of land here with 3 large trees on it and a number of smaller trees. That was 2015. And then in 2022, that block was sold and subdivided for a number of separate dwellings. That developer, if they had maintained those trees would have been forced to restrict their building envelope, limit traffic below those trees, but there was no impediment to them removing them because they were impeding development. They were in 10 metres of that house, so they had an economic incentive to remove those trees in this situation. And we see this writ large all over the city. Here's a block up in Blackwood. This is in 2016. This is in 2018. There were 2 large red gums on this block. They could have been retained because they were on the edge of the property, and there would have been the capacity still to produce, build 2 or 3 dwellings. However, there was still an economic incentive to remove them. In this situation, I would advocate a process where we start to value those trees based on the value of the improved land. So if we were to value those trees at about, so before the subdivision, that property was valued at about $280 per metre squared. And if the development was able to increase the value of that land to 560 square metres, i.e. double, $560 per square metre, we could levy the developer a bond of $280,000 or a flat fee to remove those 2 trees. That wouldn't necessarily save those trees. It would still be up to the developer whether they wanted to remove them or not, but it would remove the incentive for them to develop, for them to remove them. It would also mean that we would have some real money that we could reinvest into greening in other parts of the city. And when we talk about the kind of money that we need to do that greening, it needs to be enough money to purchase land. And as we know, land is very expensive these days. So we need to have some quite high amounts for our trees.
One of the things that I find really infuriating is that so many things exist, doing which causes penalties to be applied, but the penalties are so trivial.
It's just a cost of doing business.
That it's just the cost of doing business.
No, I agree. It's
all the way to the bank.
Yep.
Every block that I've seen cleared, that I've seen sold and redeveloped in the part of Clifton where we live, has had a bulldozer through it as the first move. Huge trees,
yep,
all over.
There's a huge incentive to do it. And I think it's very tempting to blame developers in these situations, to say, look at these money-grubbing jerks who are destroying our city.
Look at these councils that allow these money-grubbing jerks to do that.
So you know, that's.
And then they tell us how keen they are on trees.
So
right.
I work for councils, you know, so I'm one of those people, and we are completely powerless in local government to make these rules. This is a state government act. Councils need to enforce that. We have absolutely no agency in how we do that. So regularly, councils see developments that they are unhappy with, but they have no agency to do anything about it. So if you find that offensive or difficult to countenance, then I suggest that you take that up with your state MP. Certainly, I think that our development acts is going to need to change if we are to retain canopy and build our canopy.
One of the other things that I'd be interested in your comments is that a lot of the old houses that are being knocked over around where we live have large old developed gardens with large old deciduous trees. Now I know they're not Australian natives, but they're still perfectly good trees. They still produce, you know, clean up the air.
I agree, yeah.
But they just, no, is anybody looking after them?
So all of these things are coming down to economic decisions. And what I was going to go on to say a second ago was that it's very tempting to blame developers for these things. But developers are motivated by profits, and they are exploiting the system that exists. And if we as the people need to have systems that allow acceptable outcomes. And if we're finding unacceptable outcomes are occurring, we need to shift those rules. And that may well include the kind of things that you're talking about, you know, the retention of larger trees, older gardens, these kind of things. And that's, I'll come to more of that when I get to the function part of my talk. So let's move on to diversity now. So we've talked a little bit about canopy extent and tree protection laws. There's actually really good evidence that people don't like tree diversity. When people talk about the trees that they like, they tend to talk about these kind of things. These are the examples I hear about. Those beautiful avenues of jacarandas. Oh, those lovely avenues of plane trees. I really like the oaks up in the hills with the autumn colour. Big pine trees at Holdfast Bay, these kind of things. So people like uniformity. Landscape architects tend to do this. That sort of appeals to our sense of taste of what we like in the urban landscape. From a gardener point of view or an arborist point of view, including local government arborists, every different type of tree is a risk. Every tree brings with it its negatives. So eucalypts are associated, rightly or wrongly, with sudden limb failure, for example. People are a bit afraid of them. We get poplars that blow over in the rain. We see jacarandas that drop pods. People complain a lot about the Queensland boxes that have those very slippery gum nuts.
The bulgarians. Those
kind of things. People get upset about the plane trees that cause an allergic response in their airways. So that tends to lead to a tendency, particularly within local governments, just to plant proven performers. People like golden rain trees. Let's plant 1 million of those. Calorie pears, no one gets upset about them. Let's plant more of them. Where the danger that puts us in is this situation that we had in the US and Europe that I alluded to before with the elms, where we had a huge dominance of a couple of species of elm. People liked them because they're beautiful. They form this lovely canopy over walkways and roadways, and they're associated with autumn colour. And they were reliable performers until suddenly they weren't. The introduction of an Asian fungus meant that those trees were decimated. Not only were the benefit of the trees lost, but the trees themselves had to be removed at great expense, and trees were replanted. The tree that was highlighted to replace those was a couple of species of ash tree. A few years later, of course, we then had ash dieback, which caused a very similar problem. And the moral of this story is that we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. We need to make sure that we're spreading that risk, because we see those things in Australia as well. We have diseases here that will affect our eucalypts. We have myrtle rust, which is not here in South Australia yet, as far as we know, but is certainly on the east coast and I believe the west coast. We have Phytophthora, of course, that's been here for some time, and we know that these kinds of diseases are going to be mobilized by climate change. They're not just going to stay the same threat. So we need to plant a diversity of trees to reduce the risk that we have of pest and disease, limit the loss that any one species will have on the overall canopy, and also recognise that many of the species that we plant aren't in their optimal climate zone. And this includes some of our native species. So Adelaide has had for the past very long time a Mediterranean climate, a temperate climate characterised by, reasonably mild winters, reasonably mild to hot summers. We are now moving into a semi-arid climate. We are moving away from a temperate climate. And a lot of the trees that we plant come from the subtropical zone. So these are things like the Queensland boxes, the jacarandas, and some of them are from a very temperate environment. And I'm thinking here things like the prunus and the pears. We also have species like the she oaks, Allocasuarina verticillata, which is quite an important food plant, which modelling suggests may well be very sensitive to climate and is going to be one of the first native species that's going to be at risk in the coming decades. So we need to have a mind to the future and not just be planting trees that have performed well in our past climate. Local governments have invested very heavily recently in data platforms and in undertaking censuses of their urban forests. So there are products like Forestry and Tree Plotter that really effectively allow trees to be mapped in the field. You can do that with your phone or with a tablet. Go out, say, yes, it's a plane tree, it's 3 meters high, it's 10 meters high, whatever it might be. That can be done with volunteers, it can be done with contractors, it can be done by forest officers. And then that data can be democratized and shared online. So chances are your local council has a portal like this one. Excuse me, I stole that from the city of Marion, where you can put your address in and you can find out what the tree is out the front of your house, what the one down the street is, where all of the other trees of that kind are in your neighborhood and so on. They can also be used for more sophisticated planning and analysis. The City of Marion, for example, is able to plan its planting program about 7 years in advance at the moment, which means it has more choice about what it's planting. It doesn't just have to go to the nursery each year and say, what have you got available? Because it can plan this out. It can share with all of its contractors and its maintenance crews those jobs, and that allows a lot more flexibility in how it manages its urban forest. For the Future Trees project at the University of Adelaide, we approached 20 councils across Greater Adelaide for their tree data. We said, could we please have that data? Some of them were very happy to give it to us. Others needed a little bit of convincing. They were a bit concerned that it might be misused, but everyone ended up giving it to us, which was great. Some of them had very sophisticated tree management systems. Other ones were a little bit more rudimentary. But we were able to put together a database of 612,000 trees in the urban forest, which to my knowledge is the most extensive urban forest database for any single city. We went through a very elaborate process of checking the taxonomy. It might not surprise you that council arborists are not necessarily the most thorough at making sure that they've got the most up-to-date taxonomy when they're doing their surveys. And we found that there are about 650 taxa, including quite a few cultivars. And when all was said and done, we had about 560,000 reliably identified georeference trees. The reason that number went down quite a bit from the 612,000 is one council did not collect individual locations for its trees, but they collected them in data segments, in street segments. So they'd say in this 300-metre stretch of road, there are 12 jacarandas and a pear tree or something like that. And that wasn't useful for our analysis. And this is what we found. Is this group reasonably familiar with the idea of Shannon diversity? No? Okay, so Shannon diversity is a measure of diversity that counts species richness, the number of species that exist within an area, and the relative abundance, the evenness of those species as well. And so basically higher values are better. Within a native forest system, you might expect 3 to 4, something like that, depending on the ecosystem. But Adelaide was looking pretty good. So the Shannon diversity was about 4.2, which is the highest that we found for any city internationally. When we compared that against Melbourne, for example, Melbourne was sitting at about 3. So that's great news. We've got a lot of diversity in Adelaide, more than I thought. Individual councils ranged quite a bit, and that tended to be a function of their size. So 2.9, I think that was Walkerville, smallest council in Adelaide. You know, they just don't have that many trees. But there was a big variety in what that diversity looked like amongst the different individual councils. I think that the reason this was so high was due to that greater extent of the data set overall than, we collected so many trees. But even in individual councils, it was higher than I thought it would be. A little bit of a different picture emerges when we start looking at the top diversity index, or TD50. And this is, if we order our urban forest based on the most abundant species, and then the second most abundant species, and so on, it's how many species do we need to include in order to have 50% of the urban forest. So across Greater Adelaide, it's about 13 species. You need to, once you include 13 species, you've got half of the trees. But individual councils ranged a lot. There were some councils where it would be 4 trees make up 50% of the canopy. And that's obviously very low. So those councils possibly need to do some work to broaden that out to get the kind of benefits that we want from an urban forest. And that's potentially a more useful measure of diversity. It hasn't been used as extensively, and those white bars on the bottom graph there are the individual councils across Adelaide, and the only data that I could compare them against was some regions within California, and they're in the pink bars. Yes?
Are the councils aware of that?
Well, not yet. That's why I don't want this talk shared. A few of them are, but I'm sharing this this presentation on Friday at the TreeNet conference, and then I've got a presentation to the remaining councils. A lot of the councils will be there. Then councils will hear more about it in. I'll give another couple of presentations over the coming weeks. So,
Can I ask you what the City of Marion rate?
City of Marion for TD50? It's looking at about 9.
What about West Torrens?
I don't know that I want to get into this. West Torrens is looking, I think, is also at 9. Looks like the same. Now, within those core statistics, I'm giving you kind of Greater Adelaide statistics and council level statistics there. But when we start to look at that spatially and explore it a little bit, we get a much more nuanced view. And I know that this is a very zoomed out map, but that's a map of Greater Adelaide. And I've gridded that up into cells of 100 meters by 100 meters. So each of those dots is 100 meters by 100 meters, 1 hectare. And I've colored those based on the number of species that occur in that 100 meter by 100 meter cell. You will see an awful lot of dark blue on that map. And that indicates in those cells, there are 1 or 2 species. And that's because of these avenues that we plant. You know, we plant all of species 1 in Jones Street and then all of species 2 in Smith Street. And so we get this low local diversity. We don't get the kind of mixed diversity that you need for a high level of ecological performance. And if we zoom in so that you can actually see it a bit more, here is the city of Marion, since you took an interest in it. And you can see that there's quite a pattern there. There are some areas of quite high levels of species richness, but there are also levels of low species richness. And that tends to be associated with how old those suburbs are. So you'll see in the south of Marion, the newer suburbs, the developer suburbs, that's quite low compared to the older, wealthier areas of Marion, where you get a much bigger mosaic. And that's because the older suburbs have developed and been redeveloped with whatever tree was in vogue over 150 odd years. Whereas the newer suburbs, the developers come in and said, everyone's getting crepe myrtles. So we don't see that level of diversity. And we see that in other parts of Adelaide as well. If we look at the CBD in the east, so you'll see that the northern parklands have the highest level of diversity. We also see a belt across the city of Burnside that's got very high diversity. But if we look at Tea Tree Gully, which is that northeastern suburb there, we see quite high diversity in the south of the LGA. But as you move into the north, which is Golden Grove, developer-led, reasonably new suburbs, they haven't had time to build up that diversity. And as our block sizes reduce, it'll be hard for that to be achieved. I don't have an awful lot of time to go into this. Who knows what an ordination is? No one? Okay, I am going to go into this because I want to know if this makes sense. This is, if you're not a quantitative ecologist, by the end of the night you will be. What this map basically shows is the similarity in urban forests between those councils. So we can say Adelaide Hills and Prospect, believe it or not, are pretty similar, but they're quite different to Mount Barker or Salisbury. And I'll show you how this figure is developed. If you imagine, I can create a map, but rather than with coordinates, I can put the number of red gums within a council on one axis and the number of jacarandas on another. So I can just map those councils. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, cool. Put your hand up when this stops making sense, because I need to work on my delivery. Okay, so I've done that in 2 dimensions. Now let's imagine that I do it in 3 dimensions. So it's exactly the same graph, except now I've added in calorie pairs. Still mapping them, but in 3-dimensional space. Now, I mentioned before that we have about 650 taxa in Adelaide. I'm not very good at mapping things in 650-dimensional space, but computers are awesome at it. So we basically just keep adding those dimensions until we get an impossible to visualize, but theoretically possible 650 dimension map or graph. Here's the kicker. Imagine that I've taken that 3-dimensional map and I've shone a light through it and I've turned that back into a 2-dimensional map. I've reduced those 3 dimensions back down into 2 dimensions. But what I've actually done is reduce 650 dimensions back into 2 dimensions. And that's what that map is there. That, of course, is not a perfect process, which is why we have those percentages on the axes that show this is the amount that you're actually able to visualize in this, which is not actually that high. Does that all make sense, though? Awesome, great. I can explain it to arborists then. So we can see that there is, I guess the takeaway is that there's a lot of consistency between what different councils are planting. There's not a lot of difference across Adelaide.
What does the PC stand for?
Principal component. So they're just elements of that. That's boiling those hundreds of different species down into two arrows on the graph.
I think that should be stated.
Okay.
Yes.
Tell me if I'm on a wrong rabbit hole, but if you move the lamp, the image changes. Does the same thing happen with the graph on the left?
What do you mean?
Like you've got it, the one graph on the left is a representation of the 250.
Yep.
Graph, the pattern on the very right,
Yep.
the right-hand side, will change as the lamp changes around the graph.
Yeah, you wouldn't move the lamp is the lamp is just a way for me to visualize reducing those things. You can't move the lamp. The lamp's fixed.
Right, so that left-hand one will stay like that.
Yes.
If you look at that left-hand graph or map,
Yep.
can you say which areas are better than other areas?
No, this is not about better. I'm not making any judgments on that. I'm just saying they're more similar based on the numbers of different things that they have. There's no metrics of good or bad in this.
So could you explain then how Salisbury is different? Not
Yeah.
necessarily better, but
So it means that they have a different species mix. So some of their most dominant species will be not very well represented in other parts of the not well represented in other parts of the in other councils. So they would have some species, and this could be the impact that individual council arborists could have. They might say, "Gosh, I love red ironbarks, and I'm going to plant them all over the council area." Whereas in every other council, they say, "What a rubbish tree! We're not planting those," for example. Okie doke, I'll move on. This is what those species look like. These are the most diverse species in Adelaide. And if you think back to those targets that I talked about at the very start, where I talked about the idea of 5% for species, 10% for genera, and 20% for families, or 15% for families. So 3 species look like they exceed that 5% mark. So we've got jacarandas, we've got SA blue gums, and we've got Leuphostomums, the Queensland boxes. I've highlighted the yellow ones as ones that are getting a bit close. And you'll see that I've put in a bonus yellow one, number 9, which is the Manchurian pear. And the reason that I've highlighted that one is because all of the Manchurian pears are grown on calorie pear rootstock. So in a way, they're kind of calorie pears as well. And if you include the calorie pears and the Manchurian pears together, they are quite easily our most dominant species. They're also not great for some of our insect diversity. As you move to the right, you'll see that there are an awful lot of eucalypts on there. So we're talking about 20%, double that target of what we would hope for our eucalypts. And melaleucas are pretty common as well. The main reason for the melaleucas being so dominant is because a few years ago, callistemon was folded into eucalypts, and we've got an awful lot of bottle brushes. That explains most of that diversity, but they're getting up to that level that we would be worried about. And then when we look at the family level, if we say that we want a target of about 15% as the maximum, the Myrtaceae is sitting at nearly 3 times that. And so that is a worry from that urban forest principle. But there's a philosophical issue that needs to be grappled with a bit here, because the Myrtaceae, of course, dominate Australian ecosystems. Prior to European settlement, probably at least 45% of our trees in Adelaide would have been Myrtaceae. And so maybe that's not something that we want to move away from. However, our streets are not native ecosystems. And I'm sure this group is particularly conscious of that. And the values that we have for our urban forest are potentially quite different to that we would have for native systems. So there's a philosophical question about whether we want our streets to mirror our native ecosystems, or whether we need to be stricter and say, no, we actually really need to maximize that diversity because we're looking for a different level of surfaces. We're really concerned about sustainability and shade and these things, rather than just the maintenance of a functioning range of native species. Yes.
So given the fact that a substantial percentage of native birds are disappearing out of the lofties, surely we should have some kind of relationship with the lofties, and by facilitating trees which are in the lofties or part of that ecology, allowing species which are under some threat to have a sanctuary zone where they can retreat to in the event that their habitat is under some pressure.
Yeah.
I'll take that back to why do we have diversity? I don't think that was included in the dot points as to why we would have diversity as potential sanctuary space.
Yeah.
Where your species become under threat in the traditional habitat.
So I couldn't agree more.
And given the fact that 7 out of 12 Australian animals require hollows to complete their life cycle, the question has to be asked is how many of these urban trees over a long time are going to like plain tree, are going to develop hollows that will facilitate the completion of the life cycle of those native species which are under threat.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right, and there are many aspects. If we took a poll, I suspect that the views in this room would be reasonably consistent. I think that biodiversity values would rank very high with this audience. But if we were to take a more representative poll, I think a lot of people, it wouldn't track on their interests. And figuring out, okay, what do we want out of an urban forest is actually, it's a lot harder than it might seem because people have very different values. And the number of people that I talk to who say, I love trees, just not this tree. Or, I love trees, except for, this particular type. It's actually really difficult to start to arrive at an agreed set of values. Now, I absolutely think that conservation needs to be a really big part of our urban forest, but so does some of the broader sort of more hard-nosed benefits that urban forests provide with things like cooling and stormwater hydrological control and things like that. And that's difficult to reconcile with saying, okay, we're going to move stringy barks from the Mount Lofty Ranges and plant them in our streets. Also, a lot of the trees that you're talking about would not be considered suitable for many urban environments because of some of the other issues that they have. Hollows tend to scare people, for example. They worry that tree is about to fail. These things have to be balanced, and it's I don't have a good answer for that, but these are the challenges that we need to overcome. And I'll talk a little bit more about the function of the urban forest in just a sec. But they're great points. So in terms of maximizing diversity and improving that, we need to retain as many trees as we can. We certainly don't need to be starting to remove trees. We need to just start to look at a broadened diversity of what we're planting. And this doesn't just include the number of species that we're planting. This includes the provenance and the genetic diversity of some of our cultivars. So a lot of the species a lot of the trees that we plant are cultivars, and they are things like our pears, our prunus, our jacarandas, things like that. These are grown vegetatively from cuttings, and so they're clones. They have very low genetic diversity and very low capacity to withstand pathogens and pests. It means when we start to have some threat, whether it be a climatic threat or a biological threat, they are all at risk. And the greater density they have, the greater impact that will have. So we may well need to look at broadening the germplasm resources that we've got and starting to breed some diversity into these cultivars. Certainly need to look at reducing the reliance on some of our dominant exotics, particularly if they're climatically vulnerable. And the ones that worry me at this point are the jacarandas, the pears, and the lithostomans, because they are quite dominant and they're from climates that are very different to Adelaide. We expect in the next few years to have our first 50-degree day in the Adelaide suburbs, which is a pretty scary concept. We are extending the frequency and the intensity of our heatwave events. And it is my prediction that in the next decade, we are going to see events that knock off large cohorts of trees. We're going to see trees having embolisms because they can't maintain their hydrostatic pressure, large parts of crown death, maybe branches dropping, and trees, if they're not killed immediately, having such a large portion of their crown dead that they'll need to be removed. It's quite scary work. We, of course, need to have a better understanding of climate and biosecurity vulnerability. There's a lot of guesswork here, and we need to get on the front foot in understanding which of these species is most at risk. At the moment, it's educated guesses from people like me. We need to try new things. We're very risk adverse in councils. We're very sensitive to resident complaints. Trees actually represent the #1 thing that people ring up to their councils to whinge about. But councils need to be a bit brave, and they need to have permission from residents to be able to do this work and support to try new things. They need to be able to experiment and share their ideas and data. The new data systems that we've got allow that work to happen, which is great. I think that we really need to start considering whether uniform avenues are a good idea. I don't think they are, that's my view, but that comes back to the values that the community has on what they want out of their urban forest. An exploration of the data is already showing some of the hidden gems that exist. So I'm mindful that I'm rapidly running out of time, but this work is part of what we did and looks at the trees that need to, in order to plant trees under power lines, those trees need to be on an approved list. There are 200 and something tree species on that list, and a lot of them are unsuitable for planting as street trees because they are thorny or ugly or don't have lines of sight or otherwise or unavailable for some reason. And so we've been mining that big data set that we pulled together for trees that we thought might actually make good street trees that are small enough to safely plant under power lines. We found 67 taxa that we thought might fit the bill, and we went out and we surveyed about 1,000 of those. From that work, we've found 22 that we're recommending as suitable to add to that list, 16 that weren't at all suitable, that were quite a lot taller than we thought that they'd be, and 29 that we need to go and find some more in order to make a confident recommendation. So here are some examples of some of those trees that we thought would be good street trees that we can add to those lists to give local government arborists some more choices to increase the diversity within their councils. This work's being done by Shane Selway as part of his master's degree. He's from Adelaide Arb Consulting and a great arborist if you need someone to come and look at your trees. So function, people jump to function a bit, and it's something that we don't have a sophisticated enough understanding of our urban forest to manage for function at the moment. There are lots of things that we want from our urban forests. This is what I came up with in about 8 seconds. There are also a lot of things that we want to avoid, things that we are scared of or are going to cost us money that we want to avoid. Shading solar panels is actually, it's amazing how many people complain about trees shading their solar panels. So in order to be able to functionally plan or plan for function, we need to have a better understanding of how the community values trees and open space. You know, this gentleman over here has given us a really good example of his values. But as I said when I answered his question, they will not be mirrored across everyone in the community. We need to have a good understanding of what we want out of our trees. We don't currently have that. We need to have a better understanding of which trees are going to be able to grow reliably in our area into the future, not just the things that have grown in the past. We're in a rapidly changing climate. I've been contacting botanists in arid parts of the world, in cities, in places like Egypt and Israel and Bolivia, dry places, and saying, what trees are you growing? And in many cases, they're growing the same trees that we are currently. A lot of them are planting eucalypts. So it's a bit of a question that we're all grappling with about what should we be planting? And that will require some experimentation. And we need to then be able to reconcile the traits of the trees that we can reliably grow, the ones that we choose, with those traits so that we can start saying, okay, here are trees that are going to be effective at reducing urban heat or maintaining butterfly populations, or while also not producing a fruit that is going to be a hazard for residents and so on. You know, we have to be able to balance these things. We need a much more sophisticated understanding of these things. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. This stuff is starting to come on board. So the take-home messages, the thing that you should walk away and tell all of your friends and family are about. We need to be managing our urban forests for extent, diversity, and function. We need to invest in good data, and the platforms that councils have been investing in and the surveys are making that a lot easier, which is fantastic. Here in Adelaide, we do have a heavy reliance on a handful of taxa. You know, we have our characteristic taxa. Some of them are quite heritage important things. If you talk to anyone here from Colonel Light Gardens, Okay, good. So kernel-like gardens residents are very, very protective of the trees that were established as part of the Garden City movement, and shifting those trees would be a very bitter pill for some of those residents to swallow. So we need to be able to sort of balance those kind of heritage concerns with, let's actually have a forest that's going to be able to do what we need it to do in the future. I think that we would be wise to spread the risk over a much wider planting palette. Final one, Adelaide is at the scary end of climate impacts on trees. You know, we know this. It's that shift into the semi-arid zone that's quite an abrupt ecological transition, and we see that when you move between ecosystems in the Mediterranean zone to the semi-arid zone. And we have a lot of work to do to be able to bridge that and understand how we can make that transition. But the good news is that we can ask for help from interstate, because you look at Melbourne, and Adelaide is what Melbourne will look like in the future, and Sydney and these other sort of wetter places, they are going to have to come up with the same challenges. And I think they're quite interested in investing in us and helping us to overcome these problems, because they're helping themselves in the future as well. So that's cause for optimism. And one of the reasons that I'm so keen to talk about this at the National Conference on Friday. So I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I hope that I've convinced you that trees are much more interesting than butterflies. I'd like to thank my collaborators, particularly Kate Delaporte at the Wade Arboretum, and Eleanor Dormont and James Dorey. They've done some fantastic work. Tate and Shane did that power line work that I alluded to before, and the people who have given us money. The University of Adelaide's been very generous, as has Green Adelaide. We've also had goods funding support from Wellbeing SA and SA Power Networks, and Resilient South, the cities of Holdfast Bay, Marion, Mitcham, and Onkaparinga, who fund my salary and have given me time to skive off, you know, more boring work to work on this more interesting stuff. So thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Questions on the
Love questions.
on the chat. That we'll just so you made some comments about council not having the power to change, and so Bruce has asked, why do we require council approval then?
Okay, so under the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act 2016, there are a range of planning rules that are established, and that is a state government act. Councils are required to implement that act. They need to implement that on behalf of the state government. So councils around planning rules do not have the capacity to pass local laws. We have one planning code for the entire Greater Adelaide area, and councils implement that on behalf of state government.
Right. The other thing that Bruce was also talking about in the chat here is he also comments about ecological diversity, increasing ecosystem resilience, which
it certainly can.
Certainly commented there. And then Lionel's asked, if some species are undesirable, is it still good to have so much variety?
Well, this is the fundamental question. I would say yes, because we will lose species. We will lose species due to climate, we will lose species due to pest and disease, and we will lose species due to the combination of those things. So some of the species that we have are completely undesirable for some things. So your average entomologist would decry camphor laurels as the most useless, worthless tree ever, because they're biologically pretty dead. You know, there aren't too many invertebrates that use them. But they have a benefit. You know, they cool the landscape, they provide structural diversity, they are vantage points for birds, they are used by mammals, they have aesthetic value, you know, they are important. And the reason that we are looking to up this diversity is to increase ecological redundancy, to spread the risk. And so I would be very reluctant to point at a particular tree and say that's useless, we shouldn't plant that. I would be rather saying we've got an awful lot of those, let's plant something else.
Sure.
But that comes back to that mapping of what are the traits of these trees and what do we think are important. Yes.